So welcome everybody to this conversation with Dr. Rainer Zitelmann. He's an historian, he's a sociologist, and he's also a successful entrepreneur. He has published more than 25 books. And his latest book is not very politically correct, because these days capitalism is the public enemy number one. And he has just published a book titled Capitalism is the Solution, Not the Problem. So tell us, what's the main premise of this book, apart from the obvious title?
Yes, maybe it's a little bit surprising, because today people blame capitalism for all the bad things that happen in the world, for exploitation and for climate change and social inequality and all these things. So for most of the people, capitalism is a bad word, and maybe so it comes to surprise that I say capitalism isn't the problem, but it's the solution. But I will give you only one example in the beginning. 200 years before capitalism, at 1820, 90% of the worldwide population was living in extreme poverty, 90%. And today, the rate has fallen to only 10%. And I think it's a great success story. Of course, there is starvation, there is poverty today in the world. But what's very important, half of this reduction happened over the last 35 years. And I think this is one of the reasons that I say capitalism is not the problem, but it's a solution. And what I did in my book, it's a little bit different from what other people do. This is not a book about theory. It's a book about real world history, about economic history. I compare things that you can compare. For example, I compare the socialist time in China with Mao and today. I compare North and South Korea, East and West Germany, Chile and Venezuela, and North and South Korea. And this is another way than if you discuss with socialists, they do something else. They have a theory and they compare the theory of their utopia or ideal world with the real world. Yes, and I think it's unfair. It would be the same, I'll give you an example, if you are married and then I compare your marriage with something in a book, in a love story, with a perfect love. And then your wife comes to you and say, we have to divorce, but because I saw our marriage and I compared it with this great story in this book, and it's by far not so perfect. Yes, you would say, here, moment, it's crazy. Please compare our marriage with our friends and acquaintances. And this is what I do. I think it's more fair if you compare countries and situations that you can compare. I give you one example for this. Korea. What a lot of people don't know is that North and South Korea were very, very poor even in the 60s. Not only North Korea, but South Korea. One of the poorest countries in the world, as poor as the poorest countries in Africa today. And then, North Korea, planned economy, socialism, South Korea, capitalism, two different systems. And you can compare what happened. In North Korea, today the situation is very bad. People are on starvation and suppressed. And so in South Korea, I was there because my book was also published in South Korea. And I've been there in this hotel, and then I went down and I saw the biggest shopping center I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen in Europe such a shopping center. And I have some devices, my TV, for example, is from South Korea. And this happened in the last decades, okay, because they are very ambitious and industrious, but it's also the economic system, because the history is the same as the history for North Korea. The culture is similar, and the language is the same. The only difference is the economic system. And the same was in Germany. I have one chapter about Germany where I live. A lot of people don't know it. Before reunification, in East Germany, it's a socialist, for example, only 17% of the people had a telephone, 17%. And in Germany, it was 99% of the people having a telephone. And it's not the only example. Another example is with cars. A lot of people don't know it. You had to wait in East Germany, socialist Germany, between 12 and 17 years to have a car. You had to subscribe to a list if you want to have a car in 12 years.
To have the same car, actually.
Yes, this is the funny story in addition to it. You know, they call it in German Trabi, Trabant. Yes, there was another one, Wartburg, but these were very bad cars. But in West Germany, you could go to every store, and if you have enough money, whether you buy Volkswagen or Mercedes or BMW or whatever, you can buy it and take it with you in some hours. And you did. So these are only some examples. And in Germany, it's the same. You can compare it. The same history, the same culture, the same language, but the economic system.
But let me elaborate on this, Dr. Zitelmann, because I mean, you say that your book is not about theories, about practice or empirical data, so evidence as to which economic system works better, right? But then, in order for you to make these comparisons, you have to create categories of capitalist versus non-capitalist systems. And for you to do that, you have to bear in mind at least a definition of what's capitalism. So how would you define capitalism?
Yes, a good question. Capitalism, for me, capitalism is if you have private property and if the companies, the entrepreneurs decide what to produce, how to produce, and the prices for the products are made on the market. In contrast, socialism is you don't have private property, it's owned by the state, and not the company decides what to produce and not the consumer, but there is a central planning authority who makes the decision. So this is the contrast. But let me add this: nowhere in the world you have pure capitalism or pure socialism. Even in the socialist countries, I mentioned East Germany and North Korea as two examples, you had a little bit of market and private property, even in these countries. And in the so-called capitalist countries, even in the United States, you have a lot of socialism, a lot of welfare state. So you don't have a pure capitalist or pure socialist system today in the world. It's a mixture, but I have a theory and I call it the test tube theory. I will tell you what I mean with this. If you have a test tube, and you have two ingredients. You have market or capitalism, and you have state and socialism. And then you mix it and you look what happens if you change it. I'll give you two examples. Venezuela. Venezuela was 1970 one of the 20 richest countries in the world. One of the 20 richest countries in the world. Then they started with a lot of labor market regulation, more state, and the situation became worse. But it became really worse after 1999 because Hugo Chavez came to power with this, what he called the socialism of the 21st century. And what did he do? The same things as socialists do always, nationalization and more state, less market. In the beginning, he had great luck because at this time the oil prices went up, and Venezuela is depend absolutely from oil prices. So he had good luck, and so he could he could spread a lot of money to the people, not only in Venezuela, but also in Cuba or even in the United States. So the first years were not bad, but not because of the system, but because of these oil prices. But then oil prices dropped, and he went on with his nationalization, more state, less market. And what happened? You know what's the result now? When I wrote the book, the inflation rate in Venezuela was 1 million%. It means you can't even measure it. 1 million%. 10% of the population fled from Venezuela to other countries. And so you see, this is the result. If you give in this test tube more state, and on the contrary, let's take China as an example. I start my book with China. It's also a mixture today between socialism and capitalism, like other states in the world. But what happened? In the end of the 50s, there was the biggest socialist experiment in history in China. Mao called it the so-called Great Leap Forward. 45 million people died. 45 million people died. I have lectures all over the world, and I asked young people, have you ever heard about the greatest socialist experiment in history and how many people died? Almost no one had heard about this. They heard it at school or at university about the evils of capitalism, but they didn't hear about this biggest socialist experiment, what happened there. So this was the end of the 50s. Then Mao Zedong died in 1976, and after Mao Zedong, they started with economic reforms by Deng Xiaoping. More private property, more market. So what happened? 1981, 88% of the Chinese people lived in extreme poverty. 88%. Today, it's less than 1%. This happened never before in history. Hundreds of millions of people escaped extreme poverty. And why happened? Why did it happen? Of course, China is not a pure capitalist country today. It's a mixture between socialist elements and capitalist elements. But this is not important. What is important? The development that in the last 40 years, if you take this test tube, more capitalism, private property, more market, and the result was great for the people in China. And I've been in China, and I spoke with one of the leading economists. His name is Chang Wang. By the way, he's a big Hayek fan, and he wrote a great book, The Logic of the Market. And I spoke with him, and he told me in the West, there's a big misunderstanding about the success of China, because in the West, the people think that it's because of the state and planned economy. This is the reason why they are successful. And he told me, no, absolutely wrong. Every success was not because of the state, but in spite of the state. He repeated this always, not because of the state, but in spite of the state. And so you see, you asked me the definition. I said, here's definition capitalism, here's definition socialism, but we don't have this pure capitalist or socialist system. We have always a mixture, but what the important thing is the development. Do we have more in direction capitalism, more market, more private property, or as in China, or more state as they have in Venezuela? And you see the results.
No, it's clear that once you get into practice, there are many imperfections. So there is no perfect system. As a matter of fact, I was meaning to tell you, there are some colleagues of mine who would address the Chinese example as a different sort of socialism, even though the ruling party is obviously the Chinese Communist Party. The system as a whole resembles more of fascism than communism, because there is private property, but everything is to some extent controlled or planned or directed towards the so-called common good by government. So it resembles more that sort of socialism than communist socialism. But that's something entirely,
it's
theoretical. But I was meaning to ask you. So
Please, that's an important point. Let me come to this. Of course, yes. If you look in politics, China is a dictatorship, no question, with the Communist Party, and you have no freedom of speech, you have no freedom of press, nothing. People are controlled. I spoke about the economy now, yes.
Absolutely.
The reason of the progress in the economy. Let's take another example. China. I have a lot of contact with China, and I know with Vietnam. I know a lot of people there. Vietnam is the same example. You have the ruling Communist Party, and it's a little bit not so unfree as it is in China. You have a little bit more. It's not free, of course, not, but it's a little bit more with freedom of speech and so in Vietnam as it is in China. But okay, it's a one-party system. But in the economy, they made so great progress. In the last 25 years, there was no country in the world with a comparable size from the population as Vietnam who made so much progress in economic freedom. And the result was great for the people. And if you compare, for example, today, the percentage the percentage of government expenses to the GDP. It is in Germany 45%. It is in United States 35%, and it's in Vietnam 29%. So when we speak about
that's absolutely correct. I was just referring to the fact that even though they are socialist systems when it comes to politics.
Yes.
That socialism, because it enables or allows the existence of private property, resembles more that of fascism than communism. But let me ask you this, because your focus on the economic system, which I think is accurate, obviously, leads me to my next question. So there are some other historians, such as, for instance, the case of scholar Neil Ferguson, who would say that there are many. He puts it this way: there are many killers app of Western civilizations. Okay, so one of which is liberal democracy, another one is capitalism or free market, etc. Now he says that there are many cases throughout history, and maybe China is one of those, who have kind of downloaded just some of these applications, some of these apps, but not all. So you would agree then that China has downloaded the capitalism app, but not liberal democracy? And if so, do you think, Dr. Zitelmann, that it can last long in time, or that the system will eventually collapse?
I would hope so.
I'm referring to this odd combination between communism and capitalism, for instance.
To be honest, we don't know what will happen. There are examples. I have another chapter in my book about Chile, yes, and you know how it was in Chile. First, you had the socialism with Allende. It was a total economic disaster. Then you had Pinochet, who was really a dictator, yes, with torture and all these things with Pinochet. But on the economic side, it was not a bad system. On the contrary, on the economic side, it was in the Pinochet times, he hired the so-called Chicago boys who were influenced by Milton Friedman, and then they had a lot of economic reforms, and this was good in the economic sense. But on the other hand, it was a dictatorship. But then the dictatorship ended, and today it's a democracy.
That's what I was referring to. Regimes collapse, and it seems, because of empirical evidence from recent history, that you cannot have economic freedom without political freedom.
I would like to agree this. I would love this, and Milton Friedman said this, but I'm not so sure, to be honest. I would, of course, I would hope very much for Chinese people that they don't have only more economic freedom. Even there, they have to do a lot more to have more economic freedom, but also with freedom of speech and so. But today, it's not so. You have some examples, not only with Chile, as I wrote about South Korea. Even South Korea was, today it's a democracy, but it was not all the time. First, they introduced capitalism, but at this time, this was absolutely no liberal democracy, but then they changed. In history, you are right. If you look at Western Europe, we had always this combination between liberal democracy on the one hand and free market economy on the other hand. But whether this is in the future, whether it's a kind of a law that it can only exist together, I would hope so, but to be honest, I'm not sure whether this is the case.
Okay, let us go back for a bit to this profound ignorance you just mentioned about the pitfalls or the disasters of socialism and communism. For instance, the case of Mao Zedong in China, or the Great Famine, etc., that killed so many millions of people, and also the ignorance about the success of capitalism. So how do you explain such an ignorance, especially in the West?
It has a lot of reasons, and I think it changed in the last decades. I remember in 1989, when the wall came down and when there was the end of communism, a lot of people understood that capitalism is the better system. But now we have a younger generation, and in universities and at school, the teacher don't tell them about the truth about socialism. They tell them about capitalism, racism, and whatever, especially in the universities in the United States, but also here in Germany. I don't know how it is in Spain, but I would guess it's always is as well more left-sided.
The same, yes.
It's similar, and this changed, and so young people, they don't know enough about socialism. And this is one reason why I wrote my book and why I have so many lectures, because socialists tell them something about, it's like a religion, about the utopia, how society could be. But I tell them, please look what really happened. You can speak about socialism, but think about this. In the last 100 years, there was not only one example where a socialist experiment worked. Never. I have in my books also examples what they called democratic socialism in the UK in the 70s or in Sweden. This was also a total disaster what happened there in Sweden. And then there are other issues. For example, a lot of young people today are very much concerned about environmental policies and about climate change and air pollution and all this stuff. And they tell them that capitalism is to blame, but they don't know the biggest problems with environment and with air pollution and all this stuff were in socialist countries, like in East Germany or in the Soviet Union. I read some books in the last weeks about this ecological disaster in the Soviet Union. And I have here something I want to recommend to all people to listen to us. 2 things that you can get for free. Sure, of course, you should buy my book, but first I will tell you 2 things that you can get for free. The first one is this. This is with, let me check, 470 pages. You can get it free on the internet. If you Google, I think you know it, the Index of Economic Freedom from the Heritage Foundation. You can download it and you get it for free. And then the next thing that I recommend to it, it's also free. It's here the Environmental Performance Index. It's EIP, also for free. It's from Yale University. So, and then if you compare it, here you have a ranking of the countries that with the best policy against environmental problems. For example, Denmark and also the UK and some countries are very good. I have here this ranking. Number 1 is Denmark, Luxembourg, Switzerland, United Kingdom, and so these are the countries in this index. And here it's another index, the index of economic freedom. You can call it also the capitalism index, because it's a ranking in the order what countries are economic free and not free. And you find at the top economic free countries as Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Singapore. And in the end of the list, you find countries like Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela. And then they did something that is very impressive. Here you can find it, page 26. They compared economic freedom index and environmental performance index. And you have to understand, for the index of economic freedom, I have a chapter about the index of economic freedom in my book. They distinguish between 5 different groups of countries: free, mostly free, moderately free, mostly unfree, and repressed countries. And then they compare the environmental performance index with the index of economic freedom. And you see, in the free, economic free countries, the most capitalist countries, they have the best environmental performance score with 76. In the mostly free countries, they have 70. And in the repressed countries and mostly unfree, they have 48 or 50. So you see, here's a connection as well for people who are interested in this stuff, connection between economic freedom and environment. And you can have all this information for free on the internet. And I would love it if at school, the teacher tell them these things, that people, here, look on the internet, you can get it for free, compare it. But they don't teach this stuff. They tell them how bad capitalism is.
Yes, and they also don't teach more free market or capitalist solutions to environmental problems, and not state-led solutions. So we can agree, of course, that empirical evidence in support of capitalism and its success is, stronger than ever. However, I wouldn't say that capitalism is stronger than ever. Actually, it's perceived or is seen as a problem, right? Which is half the title of your book.
Yes.
So actually, we see always how capitalism is followed by some surnames or prefix. So we speak about social capitalism or environmental capitalism or circular capitalism, and even in private-ish circles or forums such as the World Economic Forum, we read and we listen to major corporations speaking about the death of capitalism. So what do you think this is going to play out in the near future?
Yes, this is the real problem. You are right. This is the reason why I wrote this book, and this is the reason why I have so many articles and lectures about this topic, because you are absolutely right. There's a lot of evidence why capitalism is the solution, but capitalism is the defensive. And the reason is exactly what you mentioned. The real problem are not the leftist ideologies. They are not the problem. The problem is that the entrepreneurs and the rich people who have money and the people who could do or should defend this capitalist system, that they doesn't do it. Yes, on the contrary, yes, they make something that I call like an appeasement policy, what was never successful in history. They have always you know, if you discuss with them, or if you see a discussion between a socialist on the one hand, and then maybe an entrepreneur, and on the other hand, the socialist is always in this mood to attack, and the other one is always in this to defend and says, I know you have so many problems with capitalism, and I know it's not the best system, and we have so many flaws, and we have to correct. No, don't do this. If I come to people, even if they think a different way, to students, I have always a T-shirt, and on my T-shirt it's I love capitalism on this T-shirt, yes? And I tell people, capitalism is a great system. It's not that you say, yeah, I know it's bad and we have to change. No, it's a great system. And this is the real problem, that you have not enough people like I try to do it, who are, you know, proactive, pro-capitalism with enthusiasm. And what's also important, to speak not so much about theory. I know a lot of libertarian people in a lot of countries. I know them in the United States, in the UK, and they do in some ways a great job, but in another way, they have to learn a lot, because they speak too much about theories. They will tell you, here's Mises and Hayek and Friedman, and I have this quote, and there's this economic theory, and so, okay. But for most of the people, they don't understand it. They are not interested in theory. And you have to reach out for young people who are interested in topics I spoke about, like, for example, environmental problems, or about poverty in the world. And so, I tried to speak not so abstract and not with so many quotes and theory. And I speak with enthusiasm about capitalism, because today people care a lot about what they call inequality. But for me, inequality is not the issue. The real issue is poverty in the world. What can you do against poverty? I give you one example. Maybe you know, I think you know this this leading anti-capitalist economist, of course, from France, Thomas Piketty, with his book Capitalism in the 21st Century. And he said, his thesis in his book is that in the 20th century, there was more equality with capitalism. But then he says something changed. It started to change maybe 1980 or 1990. And it started to change in the beginning of the 21st century, more inequality. And for him, the really bad time is the last 3 decades, because in the last 3 decades, you have rising inequality according to his data. But what happened in the last 30 years? Never in the history was there such a reduction of poverty than in the last 35 years. And you see, this is a completely different view. If Piketty looks back to the last 35 years, it's very bad because of rising inequality. And if I look back to the same, it's such a great success story. And I come back to this example with China. Of course, there's more inequality today than it was, for example, 50 years ago, when everyone was poor. There were no millionaires and no billionaires. Today, you have so many billionaires in China as nowhere in the world, with exception of United States, where some more. So you have more inequality maybe. But if I would ask people in China, would you like to come back 50 years back, or to the time of Mao Zedong, because everyone was more equal? They would ask me whether I'm stupid, because and so you see, it's very important whether your focus is more on inequality or your focus is more on poverty.
So for instance, in China, it's true that there are now, for the first time in history, millionaires, but it is also true that for the first time, maybe also in history, there is middle class. and that's thanks to capitalism. So the problem is not inequality, provided that the bottom segment is also increasing and getting out of poverty, which is the real issue and the real. Yes. It should be a real concern. But this is precisely, I think, why capitalism is often times, in a defensive mode, contrary to socialism, etc. And I think that the reason why that's the case is because these two, capitalism and socialism, they speak in different languages, one of which is much more appealing, especially for idealists, young people, and people who have everything, their lives already settled and planned, and they don't have to worry about, starving, etc. The two languages are pragmatism. That's what capitalism is about. So capitalism is good because it works, and empirical evidence points that way. So, but one thing is to work or not to work, which is the case of socialism. And the other language is a moral language, which is the one that socialism or the left uses.
Absolutely.
Whether or not the system is good, although it may not work, that's what they say, or because of its imperfections or poorly implemented. And on the contrary, capitalism is evil, despite it being, perfectly functioning, etc. So these are two different languages. Yes, how do we bridge the gap between these two languages?
Absolutely, I agree. Yes, it's a real problem because socialism is more like religion. In former centuries, religion was very strong. Today, religion is not so strong as it was maybe 100 years ago, for example. But instead, the church, maybe sometimes they promised the perfect world, but it was in paradise later on after you're dead. And then came the socialists in the 20th century, and they promised paradise now. We will have it now. And it was the same promise with National Socialism, for example, in Germany. They spoke about the German community. They called it Volksgemeinschaft, like a perfect society. And this is the problem, that they fulfill a desire for religion, like religious do. And if we support capitalism, we don't want to promise people things that are absolutely not realistic. And this is a real problem. And another problem is this. I can recommend you a book. The author, I know him, is Christian Niemitz, and the title of the book is Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. And the question he wants to answer in this book, why is that socialism always failed, but in spite of the fact that it always failed, it's so attractive for people? And one reason is because there's one trick you have to understand with socialism. First, when it starts, all these intellectuals are so enthusiastic about it. I told you last time about Hugo Chavez. All intellectuals in the world, they were so enthusiastic. Socialism, 21st century. And it was the same even with Stalin, the time from Stalin. All these intellectuals were so enthusiastic about Stalin and about Mao Zedong, who were mass murders with millions of people who died there in the dictatorship. But the intellectuals were enthusiastic. And then they saw, okay, there were some problems in the systems they had to admit. Okay, then they blamed, maybe it was the fault of capitalism, maybe because of sanctions against this country, or maybe not everything is perfect, but it's the imperialism. If something that doesn't work in Cuba or North Korea or Venezuela, it's maybe American imperialism who's to blame for this. This is the next step. And then the system failed 100%. And then they said, oh no, it was not socialism. It never was socialism. It has nothing to do with socialism. But next time it will work. And this is the real problem, yes? That if you discuss with the same people today who told us 20 years ago that Venezuela is socialism in the 21st century. Today they will tell you, no, it was never socialism. But I have the idea how it will work. And this is what drives me crazy. You know, in this book, he gives example. He said there were 24 socialist experiments, and every experiment failed without any exception. And this is the same. I give you an example. Take a housewife that makes a cake, maybe, yes, she invites the guest at the weekend, and the guests get sick. Maybe even they have to vomit, yes. So and then she understands, okay, something was not good with the recipe. I have to change it. Next week she invites guests, same recipe but with some changes. The result the same. Guests vomit. Yes. Then week 3. She understood, okay, this recipe was not perfect, but I keep the same recipe, but I've made some changes. Invite the guest again. What happens? Guest vomit again. So, and then she will do it 20, 30 times. I think you will tell me there's no housewife everywhere in the world who would be so crazy to do this. But this is exactly what socialists did. Yes, it failed all the times. And you are right. This is a real problem, and I have no answer.
They keep on doing it. So I mean, we should imitate them and say that the pitfalls of capitalism are because they were. I mean, it was poorly implemented. We should do the same thing they do. But again, capitalism is not about morality. It's not being good or evil. It's about working or just not working. So it's about pragmatism.
But you're absolutely right. This is the real problem. Hayek wrote it one time. He wrote, we have always this disadvantage if we compare ourselves with socialists, because they can promise their utopia, their paradise, and this is what we can. So maybe, but I'm too honest. I don't like to promise people things where I absolutely know that it's not realistic. But you are absolutely right. This is a disadvantage. But what we can change is this, don't, like you call it, this defensive mentality. Yes, I think this makes a big difference if you do it in the way I do. Yes, with this enthusiasm. Yes, that I say I'm proud to be a capitalist, and I'm enthusiastic about capitalism because here are the facts. And I found out that even young people, students who think in a different way than I, they accepted me more than all these other people who were always so defensive. Yes, because most people, they don't like if someone is weak. And I think it's a sign only of weakness if you have this appeasement policy. If they meet at the World Economic Forum and they speak about, today we speak about social inequality and how capitalism has to change and how bad we are. And so, yes, and this is a sign only of weakness. And people don't want weak people. They want strong people with a strong belief, with strong convictions. This is something that we have to learn.
No, absolutely. Go to the on the offensive, and I would also add one thing extra. So to that recipe, to follow your analogy of pragmatism, we could add the flavor of which is a moral flavor, which is personal freedom. So capitalism is not only pragmatic; it's the better system, insofar as it is better aligned with personal freedom and personal responsibility.
And if you make the moral case, and this is the reason why I started our interview with this, let's speak about poverty. I think this is a very moral issue to speak about poverty, whether people are on starvation or not. And this is the most important fact. If I speak to young people, the first thing they have to understand what capitalism did against poverty, and they don't know how people lived 200 years ago. Some weeks ago, I read some books about how people lived in 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, that they were so, what poverty really meant. You know, it's only a number when I say 90% of the people living in poverty, but what it meant for them. I will write in my next book something about it, because people don't know. They don't know how it was before capitalism. They think maybe it's like a picnic at a countryside, so how it was before. They don't have any idea how it was. And so, okay, we can't change it from one day to another. And today anti-capitalists are so successful because they did it for decades and decades with all their books, with all their seminars, with all their, and we can't change it in some weeks and not in some months, even not in some years. But we have to do things like you do there in Spain. And if you take me, I was a successful entrepreneur and investor, but I sold my company 5 years ago because I have more than enough money now. I can live 100 or 200 years from this money. But what I do now, I want to do something, help something to spread this message in the world wherever I can. Today I have this interview with you for Spain, but in some weeks I have my next lecture in Vietnam to speak to students about this topic, and I'll be in Sweden to speak with people about this. And in October, I'll be with this Students for Liberty again in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States. And I had a lecture in the UK. And yesterday I spoke with someone from Poland to translate my books, or from Saudi Arabia to translate the book. So what I try to do as much as I can, and I know I can change the world. But if everyone like you do it there in Spain, and like I do it, do what he can, but try to speak in an easy language. I had Sunday, I had 2 hours discussion with an entrepreneur from Paraguay who support my book, and he had in Paraguay in TV something about the same book. And he told me, if we want to speak to workers and to people who are maybe not so educated there, I have to give them easy examples. And he told me one example that was very good. He said, if you have there a soccer of a football game, for example, and there is, I forgot the English word now, the man who...
The referee?
Huh?
The referee?
Yes, and you don't want that he stops the game always, every minute stops the game. Would you like to watch this game? No, you wouldn't like. And this is with the state. Yes, the state should make some rules, but not to stop the game, and especially not to go himself on the field and then maybe to make a goal by himself and so on. This is not the role of the state. And I like this easy examples. We have to have this easy examples. And this is a little bit my criticism to some libertarian people, that they have too much theory, too much complicated things, mathematics. Okay, you need all this, but you need as well messages for people who are not so interested in economy and politics. For this reason, I write also other books. I have one book, it's now translated in 11 languages. The title is Dare to be Different and Grow Rich. And this is not for people who are so interested in politics, but it's about successful entrepreneurs. And as a role model, there are 50 successful people, a lot of them entrepreneurs. And I reach people with these kind of books who never would read this book about capitalism because they are not so interested in economy and politics, but they are interested in success, and they are interested, how can I become rich as young people? And then I speak about this, and then I start to speak about entrepreneurship. And this is another way to spread the message of capitalism. Then to show here, I will show you the great book that Mises wrote 100 years ago, and you should read it. That's for some people interesting. For me, it's interesting, it's great, but for a lot of people not. And you have to speak about other topics.
Yeah, we have to make our message much more, much simpler. Yes, definitely. Well, I mean, it's great actually that you're so enthusiastic and very much on the offensive. But speaking about referees, I'm afraid we have run out of time.
Okay.
So it's been a real pleasure, Dr. Zitelmann. Could you please finish perhaps with a final comment as to why we should buy and of course read your book?
I think people who are absolutely against capitalism, they will not read the book, and I can't convince them. For them, it's a kind of religion. But this book is written for other people who are maybe a little bit more on the emotional side or have some information pro-capitalist, but they don't have enough facts. And they look for more facts. If they have a discussion with some anti-capitalists, and sometimes they think, I need some more facts, they tell me, but Maggie Thatcher was so bad and Ronald Reagan was so bad. Here I have the fact, not it's true. They tell you something about China. No, it's not true. Here I have the facts. So yes, and this is more for this people.
It's ammunition.
Pardon?
It's ammunition.
Yes.
Yes, for us who believe or who think that capitalism is a better system, and also for open-minded people, obviously. Yes. Good.
Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It was good to talk to you.
It's been our pleasure. We will also put the description to your book, okay? So the link to your book in the description of this video on our YouTube channel. And again, it's been our pleasure. I hope the book is, keeps on being translated into so many different languages, etc. It sells good and many people read it because I think it's much needed. So thank you again. Take care.
Thank you very much.